On April 25, 1978, Soviet troops entered Afghanistan and remained there for almost 10 years. It was the longest and bloodiest war in the history of the USSR and Russia in the 20th century. According to various estimates, between 560,000 2 million Afghans and between 14,000 26,000 Soviet servicemen were killed during the conflict. Yet the paradox is that not a single leader of the country was ever able to clearly explain to the people why this war had been started and what real goals were set for the army. For millions of families it turned into pain and loss, and in the memory of an entire generation it remained a heavy, unhealed wound. A special place in veterans' memories is occupied by the everyday life of ordinary soldiers, who had not only to fight but also somehow survive under conditions of constant stress and deprivation. One of the characteristic problems of the 40th Army was the chronic shortage of alcohol. Official supplies of spirits to the units were negligible and almost never reached their intended recipients. Everything disappeared along the way, settled in headquarters, or simply got lost. Nevertheless, on holidays such as February 23rd or New Year's, soldiers and officers were almost always tipsy. One might ask, where did it come from? The answer is simple. Under conditions of total scarcity, our military adapted to distill moonshine right on Afghan territory. Of course, it was officially forbidden, so in some units there were secret, carefully guarded moonshine points. Sometimes these were improvised plants in basements, old sheds, or even camouflaged tents. The main problem for these underground craftsmen was not the equipment but the raw materials. Obtaining sugar in a war-torn country was a real challenge. Most often, trophy sugar seized from the mujahideen was used for distillation. In the absence of sugar, so necessary for brewing, soldiers substituted it with local honey, which was completely unfamiliar to Soviet people. It came in dense chunks of dirty yellow color and tasted sharply different from the fragrant, sweet honey back home. The product had a pungent, unpleasant, even nauseating flavor. The resulting moonshine tasted even worse, but, as veterans recalled, there was no choice. In wartime conditions, soldiers drank anything that even slightly resembled alcohol, and, surprisingly, it went without serious health consequences. But alcohol was only part of the bigger picture. Veterans admitted that the Afghan campaign had serious problems with maintaining discipline among the troops. Numerous cases of systematic drinking were recorded. This was especially true in the early years of the war, when no one really understood what the Afghan adventure would turn into. It is said that many officers abused alcohol, and some of them eventually became chronic alcoholics, completely losing their military discipline. However, alcohol was not the only escape from reality. Some soldiers, having access to medical supplies, gradually became addicted to painkillers. These drugs helped them suppress the uncontrollable sense of fear that was ever present in war. An injection or a pill relieved panic, gave a temporary sense of calm, but over time created a steady dependence. Others, who managed to establish contacts with the local population, the Pashtun, got hooked on drugs. According to former Special Forces officer Alexei Chikashev, in some units up to 90% of the rank and file smoked chars, the local equivalent of hashish. Smoking narcotic mixtures became a routine phenomenon, and commanders often proved powerless to fight it. No less tragic a side of the war was the fate of Soviet soldiers who fell into captivity. The mujahideen rarely killed them right away. Usually, they made an offer, convert to Islam and join the insurgents. This was a kind of chance at survival. However, in the event of refusal, the serviceman effectively signed his own death sentence. At best, the prisoner could be handed over to a human rights organization as a gesture of goodwill, or exchanged for a comrade captured by Soviet forces. But such cases were rare exceptions to the general rule. Virtually all Soviet prisoners of war were held in camps located in Pakistan. These camps were completely isolated, and rescuing our soldiers from there was practically impossible. The fact was that, officially, for the entire world the USSR was not at war in Afghanistan, which meant that there was no recognition of POW status for Soviet soldiers. On paper, They simply did not exist. Because of this, the International Red Cross and other humanitarian organizations could not provide assistance or even check the conditions of their detention. And those conditions were unbearable. Prisoners were kept in cramped earthen pits or makeshift barracks, often without heating or proper food. 4 months, they survived on dry flatbread and water, and sometimes not even that. Many recalled that it would have been better to die from a guard's bullet in battle than to endure such torment and humiliation in captivity. But even worse than the living conditions were the tortures inflicted upon Soviet soldiers. Their very description is harrowing. American journalist George Kreil wrote in his materials that shortly after the Soviet contingent entered Afghanistan, Soviet troops discovered 5 strange jute sacks near an airstrip. When one of the soldiers nudged a sack with his foot, blood seeped through. Upon opening them, the soldiers were confronted with a horrifying sight. Inside each sack lay a young Soviet soldier, wrapped in his own skin. Doctors later determined that this was one of the most monstrous executions, which subsequently became known as the Red Tulip. The method involved making an incision in the victim's abdomen and gradually peeling the skin upward, tying it in a knot above the head. Before the execution, prisoners were pumped with drugs, most often heroin, to render them unconscious so they could not resist. But the effects of the narcotics wore off long before death came. The doomed person would then experience unbearable pain, scream, lose his sanity, and finally die in inhuman agony. This demonstrative execution was intended to intimidate both the local population and the Soviet soldiers who were still at large. Stories about the Red Tulip quickly spread among the internationalist warriors, filling them with genuine horror. Local residents often displayed extreme cruelty toward Soviet soldiers. Veterans recalled with horror how seemingly peaceful peasants, armed only with hoes and shovels, finished off the severely wounded left behind after battles. On the Soviet side, all this often provoked a fierce and merciless response. The exhaustion from war, the constant fear of ambushes and terrorist attacks, and the desire to avenge fallen comrades led soldiers and officers to cross the line of acceptable conduct. There were cases of outright unjustified brutality, when punishments or reprisals became more acts of cruel entertainment than military necessity. Corporal V. Davy and Sergei Boyarkin, in their book Soldiers of the Afghan War, described an episode of patrolling the outskirts of Kandahar that still shocks readers. Paratroopers, weary of the monotony of service and longing for some form of relief, amused themselves by firing machine guns at herds of livestock. But it all ended in tragedy when they encountered an Afghan driving a donkey. Without hesitation, the soldiers opened fire, killing him on the spot. One of the servicemen, as eyewitnesses recalled, decided to immortalize the trophy and cut off the dead man's ears as if they were some kind of hunting prize. Boyarkin also described a favorite practice of some servicemen during searches in villages. A patrolman would secretly take a cartridge or grenade from his pocket and demonstratively discover it among the belongings of a local resident. After presenting such evidence, the person was immediately declared an accomplice of the Mujahideen. Most often, the fate of the accused was decided instantly and mercilessly. He could be shot on the spot without any trial or investigation. Such cases left a deep mark both on the participants themselves and on those locals who managed to survive. Similar episodes were recalled by Victor Moroccan, who served as a driver mechanic in the 70th Brigade stationed near Kandahar. He recounted an operation in one of the villages, which he referred to as the Ring Out. Before entering the settlement, the area was subjected to massive shelling from Grad rocket launchers and artillery. When panic-stricken residents, many of them women and children, ran out of their homes, they were met with fire from Soviet armored vehicles. According to his recollections, people were also finished off with Shilka anti-aircraft guns, turning the fleeing crowd into a bloody mess. In that village alone, by eyewitness estimates, about 3,000 Pashtun were killed, a number still difficult to comprehend even decades later. On February 15, 1989, the last Soviet soldier officially left Afghanistan, putting an end to a nearly decade-long war that many still call senseless and alien. But along with the soldiers, it was not only medals and orders that returned home, but also the heavy burden of memories, pain, and psychological trauma. These invisible wounds came to be known as the Afghan syndrome. It became a tragic symbol of the fact that war does not end with the last shot and is not erased at the moment of crossing the border. Many former internationalist soldiers, upon returning to civilian life, could not find a place for themselves. Those who had lived for 10 years under constant danger suddenly found themselves in a society that neither understood them nor often cared about them. For many, adapting to peaceful life proved even harder than combat. Statistics published just a year after the troop withdrawal revealed horrifying figures. About 3,700 war veterans ended up behind bars. 75% of the families of Afghans faced either divorces or severe domestic conflicts. Nearly 70% of internationalist soldiers were dissatisfied with their jobs or could not apply their skills, and 60% abused alcohol or drugs in an attempt to drown out their inner pain. Veterans organizations reported alarmingly high levels of suicide among war participants. In the early 1990s, a large study was conducted showing that at least 35% of former soldiers required qualified psychological help. But the tragedy was that there was virtually no one to provide it. Old, suppressed wounds only deepened over time, and without professional support, psychological trauma tended to worsen, turning the lives of veterans and their families into true hell. By contrast, in the United States, which faced a similar problem after the Vietnam War, a state program to support veterans was already developed in the 1980s. Huge funds for that time, about $4 billion, were allocated. The money went toward medical and psychological rehabilitation, the creation of support centers, the payment of benefits and pensions, assistance with employment, and even training in new professions. American society, albeit not immediately, acknowledged the responsibility of the state to the people it had sent to war. In the USSR, and even more so in the post-Soviet countries, nothing of the kind was created. Veterans were left to fend for themselves. The state limited itself to symbolic measures of support, creating neither systemic medical care nor rehabilitation centers. Moreover, in the context of the country's collapse and the severe economic crises of the 1990s, many Afghans found themselves on the margins of life. Society often treated them with suspicion, perceiving them not as heroes but as people with broken psyches, best kept at a distance. That is why even today, decades later, in Russia and the CIS countries, a systemic rehabilitation program for Afghan war veterans still does not exist. And it is unlikely that anything will radically change in the near future. Each of them continues to fight the ghosts of the past alone, and for many, this struggle is far harder than the battles in the Afghan mountains.